Well, good morning and welcome to the second day of AGA's National Leadership Training event. My name is Jason Venner and I'll be your moderator for the session. You can see my bio online, but I did want to mention that I'm with CLA, Clifton Larson Allen. But before I joined the firm, I spent about 20 years working in the federal government. I started my career with the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and then worked in a few federal offices of Inspector General. So, until very recently, I was sitting where you sat during these sessions, listening to these panels, and learning a lot and having a great time at these sessions, and I think you're going to do the same today. Next slide, please. As you can see from our agenda, we're going to keep it pretty tight and try and get right into the discussion with our wonderful panel. I'm going to do a few quick introductions in a moment, and then we're going to get into it. Our format is going to be that I'm going to ask a few questions, but really let the panel do most of the talking. I think you're going to see that we're going to have some great dialogue today, a lot of interaction, and it's just going to be a wealth of information. At the end of our session, at about 10 o'clock, we're going to reserve 15 minutes for questions. I know it's a little longer than usual, but I think we're going to have a lot given our panel. So we wanted to make sure that everyone has enough time. And you can submit your questions either on that left-hand side of your screen or using the Q&A function using the polling function on your social Q&A app. And just a last reminder in that regard, the evaluation for the session will be available about 15 minutes before the end of the session, so around 10 o'clock, so look for that. Okay, next slide, please. Without further ado, let me introduce our panel here. You can see their names, their titles, who they work for, but I did want to add just a quick bit of information about each. Dr. Brett Baker, in addition to his day job as the AIG for Audit at the NRC OIG, is also chair of the Federal Audit Executive Council, and in that regard brings the perspective of the entire federal OIG audit community to the panel. Cornelia Chebanow, in her role at NASAC, which is that National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers, represents state auditors, controllers, and treasurers across the entire United States. Their membership includes all 50 states, and she's a Washington director for NASAC, and therefore brings just a wide range of issues and understanding of issues and that affect the states. Excuse me there. Okay, Rick Geisenberger is the 18th Secretary of State for the state of Delaware. Rick also serves on numerous advisory boards in the state and is vice chair of the corporation that owns the Port of Wilmington. And Chris Mim, who is currently the managing director of strategic issues for GAO, is the longest serving MD for GAO, and in addition has found time to serve as the deputy chair of the Audit and Compliance Committee for FIFA, which you may know is the international governing body of soccer, which I think is pretty cool. So with that, that's our panel. I think you're going to see that they just bring up a fantastic perspective to what we're going to talk about today. So let's get right into it. Next slide, please. All right, we're in the first 100 days of the new administration, and the country is facing a myriad of challenges. Brett and Cornelia, I'm going to pose this question to you. What is the new administration doing during its first 100 days from an oversight perspective to help address these challenges? Brett, how about you go first?
Yeah, I'll tee that up. Yeah, thanks, Jason. So the first 100 days, and we're already at roughly day 30. So we're in the right at the beginning. Restarting the economy. I think it's largely due to the pandemic. I think that's something that's on the administration's radar screen. We're doing a great job of that in government. I think federal agencies are paying attention to that during the pandemic last year, and then also cybersecurity. There's some things that came up recently. We're really paying attention to that. We always put the right lens on it, but it is a moving target. Cybersecurity is very challenging to just stay on top of. So just some things in that area that I think is really important to stay in touch with that. New administration's paying attention to that. You see things like that in the news. And then transition of the administration, that's always, every 4 years we go through that process. And then this year's no different, that we have some new political appointees that are going to be in place, and just new to the work in a lot of ways, but tremendous leaders, I think. And then working with the IG community, just making sure that they understand what we do. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But so the pandemic response, so it's $3 trillion plus at this point, with the additional Corona Response Relief Supplemental Appropriation Act that was put into place very recently. There's 5 pandemic response laws that are out there: CARES Act and the Payroll Protection and Healthcare Enhancement Act. That was really very important, and money that was needed right at the beginning to be able to address those critical need areas. Medical response, small businesses, taking care of people is really what that is all about. Family care, and then the medical research. There's things that we're seeing now from a vaccination standpoint that's starting to roll out. That's critically important, and I know that the administration has that in the radar screen. 100 million doses within the first 100 days. I think that's a target. They may get past that. It's going to be challenging, but there's more vaccination sources out there than just even a few weeks ago. So I think that'll be helpful. HHS and Small Business Administration, they've got a significant portion of that $3 trillion that I mentioned. And again, taking care of people and businesses. The pandemic's really put a lot of challenges in that space, and then just making sure they get the money out timely, and then making sure that it's used properly. I don't know that we can overemphasize that enough. It's good to get the money out, but making sure it gets to the people that need it, and then they spend it properly. And then I think that's important. And then the way that that's done is that it's done through individual assistance. We know that there's direct grants and loans in that space, also to companies, just again, taking care of people. And then from a government standpoint, and this happens even at state and local, and I know that Cornelia will talk about this on some level, it's just when we start getting into a reopening process, the vaccinations will be in place so that we can start making our way back into the work environment. We've been in telework largely for the last, in remote operations largely for the last year, almost a year. We're getting very close to the anniversary. And then at some point we'll do probably some transition hybrid type approach. And then how do we handle that in the workplace? And then every agency's got a reopening plan on the federal space, probably something very similar to that, state and local. So, and then the IG community, we've been paying attention to this all throughout the last year, but we're still focusing our attention on pandemic response. It takes a lot of our resources to do this. It's important work. We need to do it. There's 42 IG shops that have agencies that get pandemic response funding. And then we coordinate weekly. And then even during the week, we have regular calls, just coordination calls. We're trying to get ensure that we have coordinated oversight, share best practices among the IG shops, because it's a different environment. We learned that going through the last year's pandemic response, that the work is going to be done in a different way. So we're sharing best practices. And then we're using more data analytics. I think that's helpful. It helps us see risk in a different way, I think, and then access to spending data. And then the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee, we call it the PRAC, that organization provides leadership across the IG community. And then that's important to the administration, that we're looking at that with that important accountability lens. And then agency leaders in the administration, they have the exact same lens. They want to get the same outcomes. So the things that we paid attention to in pandemic response last year, we're still doing it. In-person meetings, we're not doing it in the same way that we've done that in the past. It's usually some remote technology that we're using. And then building access, when we need to, we can get into buildings. Early on, we could not. We weren't able to go back and do any of our test work, and so that was done in a different way. And I think we're getting past that now in terms of some of the earlier challenge. I think we're really we've adjusted. I think that's good. Government has adjusted. And then the last point I was going to make, I'll turn it over to Cornelia to add a few things, is that again, we have new leaders in place in the new administration, just making sure they understand really what the IG community does. In some cases it may be new, the concept of an inspector general, that just the inspector general should and their staff, senior staff, meet regularly and often. And just making sure that they understand what we're trying to do. Our work is actually to help the agency improve its mission to the best that it can, ensure integrity. I think that's important. And then really the nexus of what we do, making sure programs work properly, making sure funding is used properly, that's important. And then even more so with the pandemic response. There's so much additional money that's out there. It's desperately needed. It's $3 trillion or so. That's on top of the normal $3 trillion that we have. We just got to make sure it's being used properly and getting to the right places. So I think having that conversation with agency officials, particularly the political appointees that are coming in at the beginning, critically important. So with that, I was going to turn it over to my colleague, Cornelia.
Good morning, everybody, and thanks to AGA for having me on this esteemed panel. When I thought about the question, what can we expect from the first 100 days of the Biden administration, the first thing, of course, that comes to mind is the increased oversight needed to address the immediate pandemic. As Brett mentioned, we've just had a host of laws coming out of Congress to bolster the economy, help individuals and businesses, and with that comes a whole slew of money, some through existing programs, and so we know to some degree how to handle that. But there's also been many new programs, such as the CARES Act, that has really required us to be very nimble on our feet. The guidance was ever changing. So from a perspective of somebody receiving the money, trying to assure that that money is being spent for the purposes, we've been seeking guidance. Unfortunately, the guidance was changing, which made it difficult for us to push that money out, not knowing exactly what is approved and not approved. We've got some clarity on that. I want to thank the IG community, particularly the Treasury IG, who's been great at answering questions. And as you know, for the first time, they had the role of setting up a reporting structure for the CARES Act. And so while our organization represents auditors, we also represent the controller side, which was very involved with the governors and some other folks in the states in terms of the implementation, particularly of the CARES Act money and the reporting thereof. So we've worked closely with those over the past couple of months, and we see that to continue going forward. A couple of things about the new administration. Keep in mind that the political climate at this point in time is very precarious. As you know, we had a very contentious election. We had an attack on our nation's capital, and we have very slim margins now in the House and Senate. So even today, the country is facing this pandemic ongoing. The economy is very fragile and the nation is in distress. So as a new president coming in, he's got a lot to do, even in these first 100 days. And as you can see, the pandemic really has been at the top of his checklist, so to speak, going forward. He hit the ground running. As you know, he's issued a slew of executive orders and memorandums to address not only the pandemic, but to roll back many of the Trump era policies that he thought, were not appropriate at the time for this country. One of his first actions was to freeze all regulations going forward for 60 days, to review those that were sitting at the Federal Register or getting ready to be implemented, to make sure that those were indeed efficient and things that he thought that the country needed at this point in time. He stopped the funding for the construction of the border wall, reversed Trump's travel ban targeting Muslim countries, imposed a mask mandate. And so anyway, there's more than 50 executive actions, 20 of which were direct reversals of some of Trump's policies. And the one thing that I do want to note, from our standpoint, one of particular mention was his reversal of the Trump's 2-for-1 policy, requiring that every new regulation, 2 must be rescinded. That was something that then President Trump put into place. And so, from the standpoint of state and local governments, we believe that the reduction of regulations generally can be a good thing and is welcomed. However, in this particular action, from my perspective, it bottlenecked and hamstrung some of the federal agencies from moving forward with guidance and regulation that we were looking and waiting for, and that took very long for it to get out. And so that we think that the rolling back of that particular executive order is perhaps a good thing at this point in time. As you know, President Biden is also in the midst, as Brett mentioned, of confirming his cabinet and many other high-level offices, including some of open IG offices, which will be needed for the oversight not only of the pandemic, but some of his initiatives going forward on infrastructure and other money that he intends to pump into the economy to get that going again. And to bring back the federal workforce. At the time during the Trump administration, many of those positions were not filled. So we are hopeful from our standpoint of state and local governments that our partnership with our colleagues in the federal government will continue to grow. It's very important that we have a close relationship. You know, many of the things we do is a partnership between federal, state, and local governments. And so, you know, we look to have the federal government up and running again in a way where we can work very closely together. So anyway, getting back to it, the real issue for oversight professionals is this prospect of more dollars to fight the pandemic. And as you know, President Biden is also currently working with Congress to pass his $1.9 billion rescue plan. He stated that he has appreciation for oversight. In that rescue plan, there is additional money for oversight. So, you know, we're waiting to see what happens with that. It's making its way under reconciliation, which is another issue. But so we're kind of waiting to see how that's going to affect not only these first 90 days, but this first year here in office. So inspector generals, including state and local auditors, we have valuable oversight of federal agencies to root out waste, fraud, and abuse. And with this infusion of a large amount of money, that continues to be a very important prospect going forward. And so what's up next after we finally get this American Rescue Plan? Then they're looking at infrastructure and another larger package to put some stimulus into the economy. And again, as oversight professionals, people that watch the money, this will be very, very important for us going forward. And I think that's all I have for now, but I'm happy to answer questions and certainly welcome a dialogue with some of my colleagues here on the phone.
Okay, well, that is a fantastic overview. Thank you both, Brett and Cornelia. I think just in the interest of time, we're just going to move along a little bit here and get into a little more dialogue on the next sessions. So, audience, with all that information that Brett and Cornelia just passed along, I want to ask our first poll question. If we can go to the next slide, please. Here's our first poll question, and basically is, what do you think is a key oversight challenge for federal and state governments in 2021? And you can see the 5 choices there. We're going to talk about each of these during the rest of our hour here, but we're really curious as to what you think. And please submit your answers and we'll get those tallied up in a moment. All right, well, I know there's a slight delay for the audience, but so far it looks like E is in the lead. I don't see any other responses yet. Oh, there we go. Caught up. There we go. All right, we'll give it another. All right, let's give it another 15 seconds here. All right, polls closed. Otherwise, we'll keep going. All right, well, on that, it was, if the audience can see this, A was the key concern, with nearly 40% of the audience voting, and you know, not too surprising then with that and the other distributions. We're going to come back to this question at the end after the panel and see if your opinions have changed due to the discussion. So with that, let's go to the next slide if we could. All right, here are budgetary challenges, the key issue that was just cited. And So as we were talking about, the federal relief effort for the pandemic is unprecedented. It is more than 4 times the size of the 2009 American Recovery and Reinvestment Act relief effort, and the funds are being spent quickly. Okay, so these questions are going to go to Chris and Rick. Chris, we'll start with you. What is GAO and the federal oversight community in general doing to keep pace with the requirements of overseeing these massive expenditures?
Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to AGA, and it's just an incredible honor to be on this panel with such great colleagues. That it's already been mentioned, the enormous federal response to the COVID-19 crisis. The centerpiece of that, at least thus far, was the CARES Act, which was passed last March, which put $2.6 trillion into the economy, or seeks to do that in addition to other money that was subsequently put in. Part of that is that the CARES Act contained a provision that GAO would report bi-monthly on the use of those funds. And, we've now had 6 reports that have come out. The most recent one was on January 28th. Those are all available on gao.gov. There's a tab that you can download those. Do not hit print, because each of those reports is 300 to 400 pages long. However, they're organized in a way in which there's enclosures to those, so you can go to particular topics that people are interested in. Mm-hmm. But over the body of that work, we've had 14 different recommendations, 4 matters for congressional consideration, which is our nice way of saying a recommendation to Congress that they should consider. And then we've done dozens of other reports other than just these bi-monthly CARES Act reports. We are beginning to see some results on that. The Appropriations Act for 2021, which was passed at the end of December, required actions consistent with a number of our recommendations dealing with medical supply chains and vaccines and the rest. And then we've also had financial benefits that have accrued from that, of $373 million, for example, in recovered funds from the 1.2 trillion in payment, or 1.2 billion, in payments that went out, the economic impact payments that went out to deceased individuals. And as you know, Treasury and IRS have been trying to claw some of that back. We had some suggestions on how they could do that, and so to help them save the money on that. But that's just been the GAO part of this. And I think, and Cornelia and Brett have already touched on this in a very important way, is that, unfortunately, we've been to kind of these enormous kind of crises before, and and now the fortunate part of that is that it's prepared us from an oversight committee on how we do these things and how we work together in looking at that. And of course, I'm referring to the lessons learned that came out of the Recovery Act. And I had a role in GAO in helping to work on that, less of a role on the CARES Act work this time around. But among the things that we learned from an oversight community for purposes from Recovery Act that I see as being brought forward into the CARES Act government-wide that I think is real good. First, staying for a moment just within GAO, it is genuinely a whole of GAO type of approach on this, is that, even though it's managed by our healthcare group, all the various missions and mission teams within GAO are contributing their expertise and their insights to that. And so within just my own little group, we're looking at the tax provisions as well as the funds that go to states and localities, but everybody is involved in this. More importantly, though, is as it goes out to the wider oversight community. Brett has already talked about the extensive coordination work that's being done by our colleagues in the IG community, the coordination that's being done there with the community itself and between GAO and that community. And it's, both within SIGI, but, the PRAC, I know at the very senior levels within GAO meets with the PRAC. We meet with them on a staff basis and with the individual IGs. And we're fortunate. We've always had very good relationships, as have even become deeper as a result of this, to make sure that our efforts are being coordinated, any oversight gaps are being filled, and at a very minimum that there's not overlap and duplication of that, because we can't be wasting time or money in the oversight on this. We've been working very, very closely with the state and local auditors as well. And credit to this really goes to NASAC and Cornelia and her colleagues on this, and organizing periodic calls among the whole oversight community that brings us together and discusses these issues, including some of the guidance issues that Cornelia talked about right at the outset on this. But we recognize that if we're following the federal money, where that actually gets implemented is through individual agencies that the IGs are focused on, and then down at state and local levels where it really matters. And so we need to have a unified and coordinated approach across the entire oversight community if we're going to be successful in that. The final thing that I would add on this in terms of lessons learned from Recovery Act that we're now bringing forward is the absolutely vital opportunities that data transparency and data analytics provides. You know, the recovery.gov was, you know, going back, to 2009 was really revolutionary in its time, even though it was building off of, you know, an early version of USA Spending. But just the ability now to show citizens where their money is going, what it's being spent on, how it's being used in fairly close to real time is a very powerful tool. And then as Brett was mentioning, the data analytics that allows the auditors and investigators to really do much more targeted investigations that both speeds the investigation and audit process, and also helps it be targeted on exactly the highest vulnerabilities here. I think, you know, the other, and then I'll conclude on this kind of broad lesson that we've learned, and everyone's already touched on this, is the importance of striking the right balance between having the effective set of controls in place that we make sure the money is being properly spent, with the appreciation that the money has to go out. There are people in need and their businesses in need, and we have to make sure that they are supported. That's in no way a contradiction, but it's also it does create a bit of a tension. I mean, you know, one of my dear friends is Ed DeSev, who ran the Recovery Act on behalf of the vice president, then Vice President Biden. And I know, and I think, in fact, I think it was even at an AGA session that Ed at one point was talking about the very low levels of reported fraud under the Recovery Act. And he said, but folks, I got to tell you, there was some, and we know how we could have been zero. And, you know, the way it could have been zero, of course, is not to spend any money. And the moment that you start spending some money, you're entailing risk. And the moment you start spending a lot of money, you are going to have some leakage. And so it's all about risk management, risk appetite, you know, having zero tolerance for that, you know, in terms of going after the bad guys, but also understanding that a balance has to be struck. And I think, the Oversight Committee is very, very sensitive to that growing out of the Recovery Act experience, and kind of how we can be effective partners with program implementers to make sure that the money gets to the people who need it and the organizations that need it in the right amounts and doesn't get diverted. So again, it's just an enormous pleasure to be here today and look forward to more of the conversation. Thank you, Jason.
Great. Thank you, Chris. Rick, so to follow on to Chris, what are you seeing in your role in the state of Delaware?
So, well, thanks, Jason. And I appreciate this opportunity. So we talked about the first 100 days of the Biden administration here in Delaware. You know, the hot topic is what's the traffic going to be like when Joe and Jill visit Wilmington and Rehoboth Beach? But in any case, look, most state budget officials plan for recessions. You know, I'm sure that our emergency management agencies had plans for pandemics, but I really don't think that ever creeped down into the, you know, financial infrastructure or other infrastructure of the state to really plan for a pandemic. And certainly it wasn't part of our budget planning process. In a recession, business activity slows and then it gradually shrinks. Government revenue growth slows, but it doesn't typically fall off a cliff because it's buffered by revenue sources that tend to be relatively immune from steep declines like sales tax and property taxes. But in this case, to combat community spread, it literally meant shuttering, severely restricting certain sectors of our economy, especially industries like hospitality and personal services. So, you know, a little bit of a case study by way of example, our state casino revenues literally dropped to zero for 2.5 months last spring. Motor fuel taxes dropped by about 1/3 during that period. Gross receipts taxes from restaurants dropped 45% in the spring. So these sorts of super dramatic declines just don't happen in a garden variety recession. And of course, these impacts varied from state to state, depending on the revenue mix. So states with high dependence on tourism, lodging, and sales taxes, say Florida and Hawaii, or excise taxes on petroleum, say Alaska and Texas, definitely saw steeper revenue declines, say, than states like my state. In my state, I have to say our initial worst fears have not been realized. At one point, Delaware shaved nearly $800 million off of the state's multi-year revenue forecast. Today, that figure's down to around $330 million. It's still a drop, but one that we are weathering, and through our own fiscal discipline and critical support from Congress in areas like increased Medicaid funding and coverage of almost all of our direct COVID-related costs. We've done, I think pretty well, quite frankly. Why have we done better? Well, some of it's just the mix of our revenues. We don't have a sales tax, and even if we did, while consumer spending steeply dropped last spring, it's more than recovered, albeit a lot of that tourism and hospitality spending, has shifted to other things like consumer goods and home improvement. Delaware did see some early declines in income tax collections, but a lot of the job losses that occurred tended to be in lower wage positions, retail and restaurants, while higher wage work in construction, financial services, and manufacturings, at least in our state, were declared essential businesses throughout the pandemic and largely continued uninterrupted. And perhaps most importantly, in my state, we've actually seen considerable revenue increases in two important categories. The Delaware and corporation franchise has really flourished as the IPO market has been incredibly strong. The stock market's been strong. And realty transfer taxes have set new records due to record low interest rates, rising home prices, and we suspect some increased demand from folks that have either left cities or decided to buy vacation homes or gone to suburban and beach communities in our state. So all of those things provided a buffer. We also entered the crisis with some strong fiscal controls and reserves. That wasn't necessarily the case in every state. If you look at some of the Moody's Analytics studies that have been done, it shows some states entered the pandemic with only 1 or 2 days of reserves, and others entered it with months and months, in some cases a year of reserves. We've been doing some new ways of budgeting over the last 3 or 4 years in Delaware. We created a budget growth benchmark, which set the maximum rate of base budget spending at an index tied to measures of growth of personal income, population, and government inflation. And then revenues in excess of that index have been used to boost reserves and gone into cash for one-time capital projects. So when this crisis hit, we were able to draw on those reserves. And frankly, we didn't need to make dramatic cuts in our base operating budget. And while we didn't have a lot of money for extra capital projects as a result of having to have a very small budget or basically no budget growth last year, we've been able to secure record low interest rates for our bonded debt. And all those one-time capital projects that we were able to fund with cash in 2018 and 19 have been keeping our construction industry going through 2020 and 2021. So as we move forward, I think here are the big budget issues for the state. First, the Coronavirus Relief Fund has made a huge difference for states and municipalities all over the nation. And I think you saw that in the poll numbers that you just took. The CRF and FEMA support have provided a buffer against all of the added costs of COVID. In Delaware's case, more than 85% of these funds have gone directly to businesses and nonprofits to help them, frankly, survive the pandemic and position our state and national economy for a stronger recovery. We've put almost all of our money has gone into things like buffering our unemployment insurance trust funds so that at the end of this pandemic, we're not going to have to do super dramatic increases on hospitality and personal service businesses that otherwise would see their unemployment insurance rates quintuple. Small business relief grants, filling the gaps that do exist still in the Paycheck Protection Program for hospitality, restaurants, lodging, and personal services. Grants to make sure that our childcare industry didn't just entirely collapse, and that when we do get back to normal, hopefully September, we're back in regular school and people are back at work. And the fear was that all of these childcare businesses would literally go out of business and not be able to come back when things do get back to normal. So a lot of money's gone into childcare, and a fair amount has gone into providing business grants to small healthcare institutions that have struggled because fewer people have been seeking healthcare services. So I will say that a year into the pandemic, again, I can't speak for other states, our funds are not entirely exhausted, but they're nearly exhausted. We probably have another 1 or 2 months left. And the state simply doesn't have the resources to continue the kind of programs I just described without federal support. Obviously, we're going to see how the race between vaccinations and variants goes, but it's pretty clear that we're still in this for a while, maybe a long while, depending on the variants. I think there are some big unknowns the state and local government are very ill-equipped to fund. I mentioned the things above, which I think probably every state is feeling: childcare, small businesses, things like that. What none of us really know are what the massive needs are going to be for retraining millions of workers that have likely been permanently displaced from their former positions. I think nobody knows what the cost will be, or over how many years those costs might last for recovering lost learning time and addressing the trauma that we know millions of children have faced during this pandemic, especially if their parents and families suffered from COVID. And that's going to be pretty critical as well. So, I don't know what the size of the package should be, and I know that's being debated in Congress. What I would say is I defer to Congress on the size of the relief, but I suspect that it probably needs to be at or close to at least what the initial relief package was, and maybe larger for those places that have been more severely impacted.
Okay. Well, thank you, Chris and Rick, for that a great overview of this key issue, which clearly is something that concerns everyone. And as I'm looking at the questions, a lot of the questions around the budget. So those are the big, meaty topics. We're going to take a little more focused look at a few other key issues for 2021. And panelists, we're having great discussion. We need to be a little more laser focused here in some of our answers, so we leave enough time for questions. We got a lot of questions coming in on the app. Want to make sure we get to them. So with that, let's turn to cybersecurity in 2021. And Brett and Cornelia, SolarWinds. It's scary, right? It's a very sophisticated attack. It took everyone by surprise. It exposed a lot of vulnerabilities. What do oversight organizations need to do, if anything, potentially to rethink their roles, responsibilities, their authorities, and cyber tools to keep pace with these attacks? And again, let's see if we can get a real crisp answer here. That'd be great.
All right. So thanks, Jason. I'll tee up and then I'll turn it over to Cornelia for the state and local perspective. As you mentioned, this is definitely one of the more significant attacks that we've seen, and not just government. It goes all. There's 33,000 places that use the software that was infected, and I think 18,000 of them actually had that infection get into their network. So we saw it in December. We actually saw media coverage on this in this December timeframe, but it actually started happening in March of last year. That hackers broke into the SolarWinds network and added malicious code into the Orion network management software that they have. It's supply chain management tools that are used in a lot of different places. I mentioned 33,000 organizations use that network management software. So the SolarWinds application, the Orion's networks management tool, the code was malicious code was entered into that. And then the update process to the users, the clients that use that software package to manage their network, the updates and patches that got pushed out from SolarWinds actually made it into those agencies and organizations tools, and that was what the issue. That was the issue, is that the updates had the malicious code embedded in it. The codes created backdoors that let other hackers, those hackers, back in through other applications that were on the network. and then in essence be able to put even more bad code into that organization. And then what the code essentially let the hackers do is see emails, sensitive data, alter and delete data. That's always a very challenging situation, and impersonate users, take over the accounts, and in most cases privilege accounts, so they could do a lot more damage potentially. And then interestingly, a couple very large private sector software companies were the ones that actually saw it, because they actually use two-factor authentication as part of, if there's any changes to an account, it would notify the user something's going on. So they saw something going on, they pulled the string, found out that it was actually malicious code in this Orion software package. So, and real high level, and I know that Cornelia is going to talk a lot about some things from a state and local perspective, but like two-factor authentication, as I mentioned, that's how they saw it. If there was more of that employed out there with the notification procedures that happen with two-factor authentication, it lets the real user know if something's going on that does not make sense. I think that's always important. And then internet traffic monitoring, you know, we've seen a lot of things in the news where there's things that can be done in the government, even worldwide, just paying attention to things that just don't make sense. That's what monitoring is all about. And I was going to turn it over to Cornelia to get that state and local perspective.
Thanks, Brian. Cornelia, you're on mute. That's all right. We had to have one of those. It's the
You would you think I would have learned this after being on Zoom for a year, but anyhow, thank you. I think that the challenges are much the same at the state and local as any level of government. As you know, we've had many ransomware attacks, malicious code attacks. It's an ongoing issue and has been for at least 10 years, and I don't think it's going away anytime soon. We try to be nimble and open to addressing these challenges, trying to find new tools. You know, in our particular sector, we do have IT security auditors that do penetration testing and other types of things. We also, in most states, have chief information officers that try to somewhat centralize these challenges. And I can just tell you a couple things. We work closely with NASIO, which is the state information officers, and they do a survey. And for the last 10 years, cybersecurity is right amongst the top concerns. Leading causes of breaches from external sources were 68% malicious code. And then you've got web applications from external sources at 81%. And then what they call hacktivism at 86% and continues to be on the rise. 30 states responded to this survey and said that financial fraud was the leading cause of breaches for the past year, compared to only 10 states in 2018. So you can just see it's an exponential growth in what we're facing in terms of cybersecurity. However, this doesn't come without challenges, as in really any sector. At state and local government level, we have a lack of sufficient cybersecurity budget. And in most cases, a lack of a dedicated cybersecurity budget. So there's not really money set aside to address this specific issue to government. Inadequate cybersecurity staffing. That's not only like not enough cybersecurity folks, but also the inadequate ability to obtain cybersecurity professionals. You know, every level of government, every business out there is trying to hire these specific folks to address the challenges, and we just don't feel like there's the availability of those folks to put in these positions. Not to mention that even in state CIOs, they change. You know, people go to the private sector from government constantly, so this keeping on is an issue. And then for governments in particular, we have legacy infrastructure. So the solutions sometimes are not readily apparent. There are lots of gaps, and the systems don't support some of these emerging threats. And then, as you know, COVID-19 has amplified the gaps and the challenges. And governments have a series of classified and private information that they must protect to keep the trust in government. So the issues are just, they're there every year, they change. We try to keep up with different tools, try to share information amongst the federal level. I know that the Homeland Security Department is intending to put out some specific grants to help state and locals with their cybersecurity. And so, I don't know what more to say. It's an issue. I would direct you all to the NASIO website for more information. I mean, they've got a whole series of reports on cybersecurity. And as really quickly, as Brett mentioned, supply chain risks, network softwares, vaccines, these will all open up new opportunities for these fraudsters. And so, just we continue to try to do what we can do.
Great.
And Cornelia, Jason, if I could just add
Sure.
a follow-on point to Cornelia's point. So penetration testing, vulnerability analysis that we can do. It happens in government. We do a lot more of that, I think, than we did maybe in the 90s. We've done a lot more in that. A lot of training. But to your point on knowledge management, so we get folks trained up on these important tools, the capabilities are critically important. And then it's hard to maintain those folks. And then it happens in the same way for the CIOs. They have folks that actually do those scans and tests, and then maintaining that knowledge base is, I think it's been challenging. But I think more testing and then also just making sure you got just it's basic, really, two-factor authentication, multi-factor authentication. That is critically important. I think that's where the two software companies that did identify it noted that is an important safeguard, and that just use it as much as possible. I know it's more so now than in the past. I don't think we can use it enough, though. It's very important.
Okay, great. Thank you for that additional point. All right, well, let's go on our next topic, and this one is more focused on people, and we have our second polling question. Probably going to leave it open for a little bit shorter amount of time. But this is focused on, as you can see the question here, to what extent is your agency going to be back in the office by August 1st? And you can see the choices. There's a wide variety of options that agencies are pursuing at the moment. Let's hear from you on this. Okay, the results are starting to come in.
One of my agencies at the Delaware Lottery office, as I'm watching this, I'm thinking, we ought to have a way to set up bets and people put down some money on which one they think will come out number one.
Always think about generating the revenue, Rick. That's smart. Great idea. Maybe we can bring it up with AGA. Okay. Well, polls are still going, but we're going to move along. But the big winner seems to be my organization has not decided yet, don't know, which is interesting if that's really more on the don't know side, that hasn't been communicated. Maybe it's more on the my organization hasn't decided yet, but that's holding in about 45, 47%. And the second one is option C. There will be a mix of employees in the office and teleworking. And I think that's good, because that's going to be kind of the key issue we're going to talk about in a moment. The other three options were all under 10%. So let's move on to the next slide. All right, sustaining oversight. And Rick, I'm going to pose this question to you first. So this question, again, I touched on a moment ago. This is about the people that work for you, the good people that are attending the conference today. A lot of these folks have been home teleworking for a year, and you're wondering what the next normal is going to look like. What do you think about what that is going to look like, and how do you keep employees healthy and productive, keep data secure, help them balance their lives as the notion of the workday continues to evolve during the pandemic?
Well, I thought it was interesting how everybody responded, because if you added up telework with a mix of telework with the I don't know, which I think a lot of that might be telework, you have a very large percentage who are going to be introducing telework into their, possibly permanently into how they work. And obviously there are certain government functions. I think for the kinds of work we do, a lot of it can be done via telework. Obviously, we have agencies in state government who are facilities-based. My mailroom, for example, is a facilities-based. I don't know any way to do that from home, but most of the rest of my agency, we figured out ways. And I chair a group that I've chaired since the beginning of this Governor Carney's administration, called the Government Efficiency and Accountability Review. And it's a permanent group that is working on continuous improvement across the face of state government. And I think as we've experienced COVID, it's identified some huge opportunities to operate more efficiently and effectively and transparently, and frankly, for the benefit of the environment. Telework, virtual meetings, virtual public hearings, employee training. We're doing all of our training in our financial systems now remotely, which is the unfortunate part is we had just signed a lease 2 years ago for 5 training rooms for our division of accounting, and now we probably only need 1 of them for some of the more complex parts of the training that we do. We're deploying digital signature technology. Obviously, we've always had a significant demand for digital government, and we're trying to increase our ability to provide digital services. We're seriously rethinking our physical and environmental footprint. So all of those things can save money. So, when I think about the states where, state employees are commuting for 2 hours to work and 2 hours home, and, it's just, it presents, I think, tremendous opportunities. That said, I don't think there's any substitute for also making sure that on a regular basis, you're seeing people face to face in the office. And how we handle that, I don't know. What I say to my staff, and we're beginning to do planning now for what the new normal is going to look like. But what I say is when things get back to normal, they should not go back to normal. And
Good point.
That's what we're wrestling with right now. And I hope every state and local government and the federal government are having the same kind of conversations with their teams.
Right. Chris, what are your thoughts on this issue?
Well, a couple of things quickly. First, I'm going to steal the secretary's line about getting back to normal and not being normal. And so thank you for that, Rick. I think it's great. We're a pretty heavily teleworked organization before any of this started, and we have field locations. And so we were used to working across time zones and people teleworking and all the rest. And so from a technology standpoint, it's been great. It's virtually without hiccups. The challenge that we've had, and I know, and I'm sure everyone that's viewing this, is just making sure that we maintain the connectedness on a personal level with people in a 100% virtual environment. Yeah. And, that's been very intentional in reaching out to people and saying, how are you doing? It's understanding that someone that may be fine one day or 1 month could be in a completely different place, a month or later, and then be okay again or bad again, depending on just, what happens with schools, what happened with summer camps, what happens with, their employment, spouses' employments, parents, vaccine schedules and all the rest. And so what we've seen is make sure that you provide a variety of ways in which people can have those touch points on a personal level. Some of them just within my own unit are just kind of a little bit goofy, some online gaming that we do and or that thing where you tell a story where you don't see the preceding, all you see is the preceding line, and at the end, you kind of see what a whole story was. So some of them are kind of fun. Some of them are more topical on, navigating family members with different risk tolerances, or, how do you, deal with school-age children that, and some of them are deeply substantive and difficult. Obviously, the conversations that we and many others had as a result of the awakening about racial injustice and the police killings over the last year or more. And so it's providing a variety of different vehicles so that people can interact on different ways in which they're being comfortable. That's, I think, the biggest continuing challenge that we have. In terms of when we go back, the Comptroller General just announced recently that, it's, before July 1 isn't even in the cards, isn't under, consideration for us. And then even after that, it would have to be driven, as all of our decisions from the beginning have been driven by the science. We will follow the science and do what it says. And so, we're still looking for quite a long time of being in a virtual environment.
Okay, great. Chris, I'd add one nice thing that I heard from some of my former colleagues at GAO is that you all let them take their high quality desk chairs home, and that they were most appreciative of that, because I do recall there being those really nice Herman Miller Aeron chairs, and not everyone has one at home. So little things like that can go a long way. So thank you, Rick and Chris, for your thoughts on that. Again, we're gonna unfortunately cut into a little bit of our Q&A time, but we do have one more slide, and then the final polling question. So lessons for tomorrow, and in the interest of time, panel, I'm going to ask each of you just to give your one key lesson that you're going to take forward from the panel and into 2021. And Cornelia, I'll start with you on this, if you're ready.
I think it's some of the same lessons as Chris mentioned that we learned from ARA, and that's that coordination and collaboration between the different levels of government in the oversight space is paramount, as is the clear guidance going forward. We experienced this during ARA. I think we were somewhat successful in the reduction of fraud and working with the RAT board back then. We're working closely now with the PRAC, GAO, and some of the other inspector generals on trying to get our handle around this large infusion of money to address COVID. And so I would just say, with the movement of dollars and the risk that's associated with that, I just think the consistent collaboration between the levels of government and the clear communication is just of utmost importance.
Okay, great point. Brett, how about you?
Yeah, very consistent with the theme that we've talked about. Pandemic oversight is our main thing that we're paying attention to right now. It really drives a lot of other things, economic recovery, and then we are all in this together. I think that's been a consistent theme. State and local, federal, private sector. We can't get through this alone.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Rick, what do you see? What's your key takeaway?
Well, I think my big takeaway from this entire episode is, that we tend to fail to imagine, and this pandemic was definitely a failure of imagination of what could actually happen. I think we need to take those lessons to other areas, like, say, climate change. To imagine, it's just hard to get out of your experience of the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years and imagine, to go back to 1918, which obviously none of us had any experience with. But I guess had we'd have been better prepared. That said, I think we can all be pretty impressed about how resilient, governments have been, the private sector have been. It's pretty impressive where we are right now, considering what we've been up against for the last year.
Yeah. Well said. Chris, bring this one home for us.
Just to quickly build on exactly what's been said, and I don't know that it's a lesson, it's probably relearning a lesson that we should have had before, is that, all the important national issues that we're dealing with, especially during times of crisis, require coordinated and effective responses across agencies at the federal level and state and local government. It's not a stovepiped approach where one agency operating on its own or one level of government. We need to make sure that we have strengthened collaborative mechanisms at the federal and across the entire intergovernmental system. Back in September, in our September CARES Act report, we started raising some major concerns about the lack of a national plan for the vaccine rollout. Just poor communication, poor coordination at the federal level and across the intergovernmental system. At that point, our cautions weren't taken up by Health and Human Services, and you can kind of see where we are now on that. And so I think just, the looming challenges that we have, I shouldn't say looming, the present challenge that we have with climate change and with others just really require a real whole of government response. And we've got to do much better at that across a variety of issues.
Okay. Great points all. All right, we're going to come into our final poll. And again, as I mentioned earlier, this poll is the same question as we had in the first poll. And we're looking to see if anything, if your perspective has changed over the course of the hour. And so when you're ready, please submit your answers. We don't have climate change on here, but we'll take that as for next time. Rick, what's your bet? What would be your bet for the lottery here?
I'll bet it's still
Still A?
the same.
Okay.
but I may be wrong.
All right, well, we'll give this one. Getting a little early poll results. No, it's getting a little more balanced, but just give it another minute.
Always wait for those late votes to come in, Jason.
Right. That's foolish not to. Well, it has shifted a bit, at least so far. A and E seem to be tied. Well, A is nudging out, but A and E, audience, if you can see this, I know there's a little delay, both in the 30% range, which is a shift. C has gone down a little bit. That was 21%, now about 14%. B and D, well, D wasn't that big of a deal before. Okay, so I think we'll close polling by just say A and E are about in the mid 30s. So that is a little bit of a shift over the course of the discussion. So that's good news. We aim to change perspectives a little bit with this discussion, and looks like we achieved our goal. And so with that, let's go to the next slide, please, and we'll start some questions for the panel. But before I do that, I just want a quick reminder that you can join for additional, if you have follow-up questions, think of something later, you can join us in the chat room. You can reach out to the panel. Their emails may be in the attendee list later. I know mine certainly will be, and certainly I'm available on LinkedIn if anyone wants to send me a question that way. I can route it to one of our panel members as well if you can't find them, if they're okay with that. But obviously we're not going to inundate all of you with 100 questions, but if there's a couple that people think of, I'll pass them along. All right. Well, we have a lot of activity on social Q&A here, and this one still ticking upwards with is decidedly well in front. Chris, I'm going to throw this hot potato in your lap, given your role and perspective at GAO. At what point with this huge deficit will the USA be considered bankrupt? And I can rephrase it. How concerned are you about deficit spending at this point?
Well, since the early 1990s, GAO has run a model looking at the nation's long-term fiscal challenges. And, the most recent iteration, even pre-pandemic, showed that we are on an unsustainable fiscal path. And that's driven largely by demographics, which is the aging of the baby boom generation and rising healthcare costs associated with that. Now, obviously, the response to the pandemic has required some major investments and recovery funding. There's more of that is needed that will be coming. Our point on this is that eventually, as we work our way out of the pandemic, Congress needs to, and the executive branch need to put together a plan for longer term fiscal sustainability. It's the old line, if something is unsustainable, that means by definition, it won't be sustained. And so we're running debt to GDP ratios that are at historical levels for the US and are going to be continuing to increase. And so I think that the focus needs to be on a plan, probably using some fiscal triggers along the lines that other countries have used in order to help Congress and the executive branch highlight some of the challenges coming forward. So that's the most important thing, is that we get a plan in place after the immediate crisis is over and the spending associated with that is done. Okay, great.
And panel, I'd like to open this question up to all of you, because these are really the top two questions are really around the budgets and stuff. So, I think they are, because it says aside from COVID-19, what's the biggest challenge? And I think sounds like budget is one. So Rick, again, just to follow on that from the state level, how would you respond to that question? Oh, you're on mute.
You mean the question Chris just took?
Yeah, if you have anything to add, or if any of the.
Yeah, I tried to address it. We frankly recognize as a state that we were on an unsustainable path, that we were tending to spend into our peak revenues and not saving as much for a true rainy day as what we needed to. And And I think state governments obviously have constitutional reasons to do that. And, you know, I think that you know, it seems to me that the federal government is also on an unsustainable path. How they address that, you know, I think the idea of triggers, like the kinds of things we're doing, where we're saying, you know, spending growth can only be at a sustainable level tied to personal income, you know, inflation and population, is not a bad formula, quite frankly. And if you have extra money, invest it in infrastructure or reserves. Don't build up your base budget in a way that's not sustainable. And that's what we're trying to do in Delaware. And what's probably good for the goose is good for the gander, I suppose.
Right. Right. Sound advice. Sound advice. Okay. I think I'm going to pose this next question to Cornelia and Brett. This is, and Cornelia, maybe you might want to just touch on all the single audit work that the states are doing and programmatic audits. I'm not sure if some of our federal colleagues here are aware of that, but the question is, will there be additional audits of federal funding due to the large amounts of money associated with the pandemic? And so, how do you see things going forward, Cornelia?
Well, certainly in terms of the single audit, some of the programs that traditionally didn't get that much money may be pushed into the high risk category and therefore be audited. There's an addendum to the compliance supplement that lays out specific factors that have to be audited in relation to some of the various money that came out from COVID. And then at the state level, certainly performance types audits and things that are undertaken in the area of unemployment insurance and the rise we're seeing in some of the issues there. So yes, I mean, the answer is yes, there'll be a lot of additional auditing of the COVID relief dollars.
Okay, great. Brett, how about from the federal perspective?
Yeah, I echo what Cornelia just mentioned. I think typically it's about 35,000 single audits every year, give or take like one or two. And then my sense is with the additional money, it'll go up because of the threshold. I think would probably stay the same, 750,000 in expenditures. It's going to probably go up because what typically were smaller entities getting money, they may go past now. So there's going to be more coverage in some ways in that regard. It's a tool that helps federal agencies just make sure programs are working and the funds are used properly in a lot of ways. I think it's going to be helpful, though, to just give that insight that monies are going to be in the right attention areas that are necessary.
Okay, great. Great. All right. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to try and get a few more questions in here. I think we talked about this. It was mentioned, but maybe if there was another key challenge that you wanted to bring up. But the question is, and this is number 2, aside from COVID-19, what are the biggest challenges faced by the federal government, and how are these being addressed? We talked about cybersecurity, climate was another big issue, a number of issues. But was there one point that all of you would like to emphasize again, or a little bit in more detail? I'll start with Chris again.
Yeah, Jason, just to reiterate what we've talked about, it's climate change. And the federal fiscal exposure to climate change, it's on the GAO high risk list, and the high risk list for the 2021 version will be issued next week. And it's just, that's just on the fiscal exposure. And as we're seeing with increasing severe and strange weather events and other climatic issues, I mean, this is going to be an enormous issue for us in terms of intergovernmental collaboration, in terms of costs, and obviously, most importantly, in terms of individual well-being of our fellow citizens. So I would put climate at the top of the list.
Okay, great. Brett, just follow from the federal perspective there.
Yeah, and we've talked about this in different parts of today's discussion, but getting money to the folks that need it in a timely way, that's critically important. And then from an oversight standpoint, the data that is out there, there's $3 trillion additional dollars in expenditures out there, getting data that we can use for oversight and also agencies to manage getting money to the right folks in a timely way and make sure that the money is being used properly. We're using more data analytics. I know Chris in GAO, you've got a lot of attention in that space. I think most federal IG shops are all doing that. We're the PRAC group coordinating all that activity. I think we've got a good way to oversee it, but it's going to take data, and it's going to, again, we have all got to work together on this. State, local, federal, private sector has an interest in this as well. We all got to pay attention to it.
Okay, great. It's remarkable how often the word trillion enters the conversation these days. Cornelia, given your Penn State perspective, I know the question was about federal, but anything additional you want to see comment about?
I mean, this may be more from a personal perspective or just the fact of what we work on generally, but infrastructure. I mean, we can't keep kicking the can. We've got crumbling bridges and roads, and it's just not being addressed. And, how we fund that will be important. We've got an archaic tax system, a whole host of issues really that could be rolled into that. But I think this year they're going to try to tackle it, but it always becomes a political hot button. So just not sure we'll get to it.
Thanks for bringing that up. Infrastructure that did not come up earlier in our discussion. Rick, I'm going to give you the last word. What's your?
I think infrastructure and climate change are integrally linked because they're preserving our infrastructure. In many cases, our infrastructure that's crumbling is in part because of climate change or impacts that water has on bridges and roadways. So I live about a mile south of the highest point in Delaware, which is a whopping 448 feet above sea level. That's the highest point in Delaware. We're the lowest lying state in the country. So for us, climate change is a huge issue and concern, and building the infrastructure that will make us resilient in that environment is critical. That said, it needs to be done in a financially responsible way, as everybody's noted. So
great. Okay. Well, with that, thank you, panel, so much for participating and offering your views. And I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us, for being active participants. The Q&A here is very lively. There's a lot of questions. I got to as many as I could and tried to ask the ones that address the most panelists. But like I said, if you have follow-on questions, please let us know. And with that, that's the end of our session. I hope everyone has a great day. Thanks again.
Thank you.